The latch closed with a dry click, a small sound, barely louder than a pin dropping. Yet to Silas, a 17-year-old boy, turned out of his own family home, it carried the weight of an iron gate slamming shut. He stood on the worn porch boards and did not move. The early October wind slid through his thin shirt like a knife. It found every seam. It stole every bit of warmth without hesitation. In his left hand hung a small cloth pouch. Inside was $12.40. Everything the last 17 years of his life had added up to. In his right hand was the other inheritance, a brittle piece of paper, a land deed. Across the faded ink were the words, Ravenmouth Draw, a place most people in Juniper Crossing considered worthless. If you enjoy frontier stories, where quiet thinking defeats loud doubt, consider subscribing and leave a comment telling where you're watching from tonight. The frontier always feels smaller when good people gather around the same fire. Ahead of Silas stretched a long road of wind, stone, and winter. Beyond the porch, the yard was already turning gray with the first thin frost of the season. Silas did not look back at the door. Inside that house, his father stood somewhere in the kitchen, staring at the table instead of the boy he had just sent away. The man had spoken only one sentence. 17 is old enough. There had been no anger in it, no raised voice, only the flat arithmetic of a hard year. Behind the rippled glass of the front window stood Milo, Silas's younger brother. The boy's face was pale and uncertain, pressed close to the pane, as if trying to understand how a family could become smaller in a single morning. Silas did not wave. Instead, he checked what he carried. One patched wool sweater rolled tight in a sack, a small tinder box, a short knife worn smooth at the handle, a flint stone, a cloth bundle holding a little cornmeal, and the pouch with $12.40. It was not much, but it was everything that belonged to him now. Silas tied the sack shut again. Then he stepped off the porch and walked toward the road, without turning his head once. The road led downhill toward Juniper Crossing, a small frontier town where the wind carried the smell of pine smoke, horses, and dry grain. By late afternoon, Silas pushed open the door of the only mercantile in town, a narrow building that also served as the post counter for the mail route. A bell rang above the door. Behind the long wooden counter stood Mr. Elias Hardwick, the town's merchant and postmaster, a careful man who had spent 20 years measuring risk in sacks of flour and barrels of nails. He looked up over his spectacles as the boy approached. Silas placed the brittle deed on the counter. Hardwick unfolded it slowly, rubbing the faded ink with his thumb. Ravenmouth Draw, he muttered after a moment. He leaned back and sighed. That place is nothing but black stone and wind. He tapped the paper with one finger. Basalt cliffs. No well, no pasture. The kind of land that eats a man's winter. He studied Silas for a moment, then nodded toward the road outside. You'd be wiser taking the East Mail coach, he said plainly. Leaves tomorrow. Bigger towns out there. Work, maybe. Silas did not argue. He simply reached for his pouch. I'll need a light axe, he said, and a crosscut saw. Hardwick watched him quietly as the list continued. A small sack of flour, dried beans, a block of salt, a needle and thread. The merchant wrote the numbers down slowly. The pencil scratched across brown paper while two ranch hands nearby glanced over, their eyes weighing the boy the way frontier towns always did. Coins slid across the counter. Metal against wood. Silas gathered the supplies without another word. Advice, he understood, could travel a long way, but words alone had never warmed a cabin in winter. Silas left Juniper Crossing before the morning frost had finished melting from the wagon tracks. The road carried him west for a few miles. Then the ruts ended. Beyond them stretched the benchland, a wide shelf of dry earth where the wind moved sideways across the ground instead of above it. Here, the land changed character. The soil grew thin and cracked. Grass turned brittle and gray, and scattered across the hills lay dark slabs of basalt, black as burned wood. Silas walked into it without hesitation. The sack of flour rode heavy against his shoulder. With every mile, the weight settled deeper into the muscles of his back. His steps shortened. His breathing slowed. The frontier had a way of teaching patience through pain. Birds became scarce. By the second afternoon, the sky above him was empty, except for a single hawk circling high in the pale blue distance. Silence followed him across the stone. Near sunset, he reached the place marked on the deed. A tall wall of black basalt rose from the ground like a broken fortress. At its base yawned a dark opening where the rock folded inward. The entrance was narrow and shadowed. From a distance, it looked almost like the open beak of a bird, raven mouth draw. Silas stood still for a moment, studying the cave that now belonged to him. To most men, it would have looked less like property and more like a sentence. The wind followed him all the way to the mouth of the cave. It pressed against the basalt wall and curled through the narrow entrance, sharp and cold, tugging at his coat and the loose edges of the flour sack. Outside, the air moved constantly, never resting. Silas stepped closer. Then he crossed the threshold. After 3 steps, the wind disappeared. Not weakened, not redirected, gone. The air inside the cave did not feel warm, but it did something more important. It stayed still. Silas stopped and listened. The silence inside the rock was different from the quiet outside. The benchland silence belonged to empty distance. This silence felt older, heavier, like a room that had been waiting for a long time. Somewhere deeper inside the cave, a faint sound echoed. A small drop, then another, water striking stone, with a slow, steady rhythm. Silas walked a few steps farther and placed his hand against the basalt wall. The rock felt cool beneath his palm, but it held its temperature like something patient and unmoving. He did not yet understand what that meant, but he noticed something important. This place did not breathe the way the outside world did. And sometimes, on the frontier, that difference was everything. Silas stepped back out into the wind and studied the ground in front of the cave entrance. The basalt wall behind him was solid and immovable. That fact alone suggested a solution. He found a straight stick and began marking the dirt. 14 feet long, 11 feet wide. A small cabin would stand there, pressed close against the rock face. The cliff would serve as the back wall, saving timber and blocking the worst of the wind. The door would be thick, heavy enough to hold against winter. If he could find a pane of glass somewhere along the wagon roads, he would cut a small window facing south to catch the sun. Behind the cabin door, the cave itself would remain open. The heart of the shelter, a place for storage, a place for animals, maybe, someday, a place where something green might grow. 2 spaces working together, one warmed by fire and sunlight, the other held steady by the patience of stone. Silas looked over the marks in the dirt. For the first time since leaving home, the work ahead looked less like survival and more like construction. The plan in the dirt meant nothing until timber stood where the lines had been. Silas shouldered the light axe and walked down into a shallow coulee that cut through the benchland a quarter mile from the cave. A small cluster of wind-twisted pine clung to the slope there, their trunks bent from years of fighting the same hard wind. He chose the straightest one he could find. The first swings were clumsy, the axe bit shallow and crooked, chips scattered in uneven bursts. The sound of steel striking wood echoed awkwardly through the coulee, and for a moment the work felt larger than the boy holding the tool. But the frontier taught its lessons quickly. Silas adjusted his stance, shortened the arc of the blade, let his shoulders do the work instead of his arms. The rhythm changed. Steel struck wood. Pause. Steel struck again. The notch deepened. The tree began to complain with a low, splintering groan. Then the trunk leaned. For a moment, the world held its breath. The pine cracked and dropped hard against the slope. Silas stood still, chest rising slowly, as the echo faded through the coulee. One tree was not a cabin, but it was proof. He cut the trunk into sections, splitting the heavier pieces with wooden wedges and a hammering stone. Then he dragged the first log uphill, using the slope and a series of smaller branches as rollers. The work moved slowly, measured in inches, but when the first log finally settled beside the cave entrance, lying exactly where the cabin wall would stand. The design in the dirt had turned into something real. One log was only the beginning. Wood alone could not stand against a frontier winter. Silas began with the ground. He gathered flat basalt stones scattered along the base of the cliff and laid them carefully where the cabin walls would rise. Each piece was levered into place with a stick and a steady shoulder. The stones lifted the timber off the soil, keeping damp earth from creeping into the wood during long, cold months. A cabin, he understood, failed from the bottom long before the roof ever collapsed. Once the foundation line was set, Silas turned to the wind. Farther down the coulee, he found a dry stream bed where patches of gray clay still clung to the shaded banks. He carried it back in a small sack and mixed it with wood ash from his cooking fire. Then, he shredded brittle cattail fibers and worked them into the mixture until the mud became thick and sticky. Not pretty, but strong. Silas pressed a small test seam between two short pieces of wood and packed the clay mixture into the gap. The wind slid across the cliff and pushed against the seam. For a moment, it searched for a way through. Then it moved on. The opening held tight. Silas studied the sealed joint for a long second before scraping together another batch. On the frontier, a wall did not need to be beautiful first. It needed to be tight. With the foundation stones set and the sealing mixture ready, the real structure could begin. Silas returned to the coulee and cut 3 straight saplings, each taller than a man. He dragged them back to the building site and lashed their tops together with rope, spreading their bases wide across the ground. The simple frame rose like a narrow tripod, a gin pole. It was not elegant, but it would lift more weight than a pair of tired shoulders ever could. Silas ran the rope over the top and looped it around the first wall log. Then he leaned back and pulled. The timber rose slowly from the ground. Not quickly, not smoothly, but steadily. The rope tightened, knots creaked. The log climbed upward, inch by inch, until it hovered above the foundation stones. Silas guided the end into position and let it settle against the basalt wall. One course, then another. Each lift demanded patience. The rope burned against his palms. The tripod swayed slightly whenever the wind pushed across the cliff. During one lift, the log shifted suddenly. The timber slid down the rope and dropped hard against the stones, striking close enough to Silas's boot that a single, careless step would have crushed his foot. He did not shout. He did not curse. He simply reset the rope, checked the knots again, and lifted. By the end of the week, the first wall stood upright, rough but solid against the rock. The logs were uneven, the seams wide, but the structure held. Holding together mattered far more than looking finished. A cabin wall could block the wind, but without heat, it was only a wooden box waiting to freeze. Silas turned to the stone behind the cabin frame and began building the fire system. He gathered flat pieces of basalt from the slope and stacked them carefully against the cliff face, forming a small firebox inside the shelter. Above it, a narrow crack already split the rock wall. The opening ran upward through the basalt, like a hidden vein. Silas widened the lower end of the fissure with a hammering stone, shaping it into a crude flue. If the draft worked, the smoke would rise through the crack and leave the cabin. If it failed, the shelter would choke him out. Silas struck his flint and fed a small bundle of dry pine needles into the firebox. The flames caught quickly. For a moment, the fire burned clean. Then the smoke rolled back. It spilled into the cabin and struck Silas full in the face. His eyes burned. His throat tightened. The air turned thick and bitter. He stepped outside, coughing in the cold wind. Failure felt familiar. It carried the same quiet weight as the door closing behind him days earlier, but the rock still stood there. So did the problem. Silas crouched beside the flue and studied the opening. After a moment, he saw at a narrow choke point where loose stone narrowed the passage. He cleared the blockage and widened the throat of the flue by 2 inches. Then he lit the fire again. This time, the smoke climbed upward through the crack and vanished into the sky. Warmth spread slowly across the cabin floor. Silas sat back on his heels and held his hands toward the flame. The first steady heat of the season settled into the shelter. The system worked. The fire solved warmth, but winter demanded more than heat. That night, after the flames settled into a steady glow, Silas walked deeper into the cave again. The quiet inside the basalt chamber carried the same faint rhythm he had noticed earlier. A single drop, then another. The sound echoed softly through the stone. Silas followed it. Along the cave wall ran a thin, dark seam where moisture slowly pressed through the rock. The water gathered along the edge and fell at steady intervals onto the gravel floor. Not a stream, not even a trickle, but it was water. Silas cleared the loose gravel away and set a shallow stone beneath the seep. Then he chipped the rock carefully with his knife and hammerstone, shaping a small basin so the drops would collect instead of disappearing into the sand. The drip continued, slow, patient, reliable. Silas did not call it luck. He simply adjusted his plans. If the rock offered water a drop at a time, then the shelter would learn to store water the same way. On the frontier, even the smallest rhythm of nature could become part of a system. And with that basin filling slowly in the dark, the cave was no longer just a place to hide. It had become a source. The basin in the cave filled slowly, one drop at a time. The fire held steady against the wind. The walls rose higher each day, but food did not grow from basalt. Within 2 weeks, the sack of flour had grown thin, and the small pile of beans in Silas's storage corner had begun to look dangerously shallow. Frost had started appearing on the benchland in the early mornings, silvering the grass before the sun could touch it. Winter was no longer an idea on the horizon. It was approaching. Silas packed his tools, secured the cabin door, and walked back toward Juniper Crossing. The town looked exactly the same as when he had left it, but the boy returning was not quite the same one who had walked out. The bell rang above the mercantile door again. Behind the counter, Mr. Elias Hardwick, the careful merchant and postmaster, looked up from a ledger and paused. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he recognized the tall, dust-covered figure standing in the doorway. "Well," he said after a moment, closing the book, "Raven Mouth hasn't buried you yet." Before Silas could answer, another voice spoke from near the stove. A broad-shouldered man leaned back in a wooden chair with a mug balanced loosely in his hand. Cal Rourke, a freight hauler who spent half his life running supply wagons through the mountain routes, studied the boy with a slow grin. "That cave?" Cal said with a short laugh. "That place is a tomb with better lighting." A few men near the flour barrels chuckled. Even the town constable, standing by the window with his coat draped over one shoulder, shook his head slightly. "Basalt draws hold the cold," the constable added calmly. "Wind piles snow in there all winter. Men disappear in spots like that." Silas did not respond. He walked to the counter and set his pouch down. Hardwick watched him quietly as the boy spoke. "I'll need livestock." The merchant leaned forward. "What kind?" "2 goats," Silas said evenly, "and 6 laying hens." The room grew quiet. Cal Rourke let out a low whistle. "You planning to feed them wind and rock?" he asked. Silas ignored the comment and continued. "I'll also need salt," he said. "A small keg of lamp oil and a pound of nails." Hardwick wrote the items down slowly, glancing once at the pouch of coins. "That'll take near everything you have left," he said. Silas nodded. "That's fine." The merchant counted the money and packed the supplies without further argument. A short time later, Silas stepped back out into the street, leading 2 small mountain goats by rope and carrying a crate that held 6 restless hens. People paused along the boardwalk as he passed. A few shook their heads. Others watched with quiet curiosity. The whispers followed him down the street. "Poor boy. He won't last a month out there. Raven Mouth will bury him before winter's half over." Silas heard every word. He did not slow down. By the time the town disappeared behind him and the wind reclaimed the open benchland, the decision had already been made. The goats walked ahead, tugging against the rope. The hens rustled in their crate. And somewhere beyond the black basalt cliffs, The small system he had begun to build was waiting. Whether the town believed it or not, that system was about to face its first winter test. By the time Silas reached the basalt cliffs again, the wind had begun to sharpen. It rolled across the benchland in long, steady pushes, bending the dry grass flat against the ground. The goats tugged against their ropes, impatient to find shelter, while the hens rustled nervously in their crate. The cave mouth waited where he had left it. Black stone, still air. Silas led the goats through the cabin doorway first. They stepped inside, hooves clacking against the packed earth floor, and paused. For a moment they sniffed the air. Then something changed. Their shoulders lowered, the tension in their bodies eased. One of them began chewing calmly, as if the storm outside had already lost its interest. Silas watched them carefully. Animals noticed things men often missed. He set the crate down and released the hens. They hopped out, clucked once, and began exploring the corners of the shelter without alarm. Silas moved quietly through the cabin. A small wooden barrier separated the animals from the firebox. Dry grass bedding spread across the ground. Near the cave entrance, he placed a water bucket beneath the steady drip feeding the basin he had carved earlier. Outside, the wind pushed harder against the walls. Inside, the shelter remained still. For the first time, the design was no longer a plan. The system was complete. Winter did not arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, day by day, the way frost creeps across a window pane during the night. Silas's life inside the shelter followed a steady rhythm. Each morning began the same way. He stirred the embers in the firebox, feeding the flame with small pieces of pine until the cabin warmed enough for breath to stop fogging the air. Then he checked the goats. They shifted lazily in their corner, hooves rustling through the dry grass bedding while the steady drip of water filled the bucket nearby. The hens greeted the morning with sharp clucks, announcing their presence with the blunt honesty only chickens possessed. More often than not, 1 or 2 eggs waited beneath the straw. Food, appearing quietly where none had existed before. Silas worked through the rest of the day in small, necessary tasks. He salted strips of goat meat and hung them near the warm side of the cabin to dry. He mended the elbows of his coat with careful stitches. The axe blade met a flat stone each evening, steel whispering against rock until the edge returned. Inside the cave, near the faint light spilling through the doorway, he shaped shallow beds of soil and planted kale and turnip greens. A sheet of dented tin, salvaged from an old wagon panel, leaned against the wall to reflect what little daylight entered the chamber. The plants grew slowly, but they grew. The drip of water kept its patient rhythm. The fire kept its quiet warmth. Silas spoke little, yet the shelter answered him constantly. And though he lived alone, the small frontier system he had built ensured that the silence never felt empty. Winter warned before it struck. One afternoon, the cave carried a faint hum through the basalt wall, so subtle that most men would have ignored it. Silas did not. He stepped outside and looked across the benchland. The sky had emptied. No hawks, no small birds. Even the wind had paused. The air felt heavy, pressing down against the land as if the valley were holding its breath. Then the first snow arrived. Silas moved quickly. He braced the cabin door with a thick timber beam, checked every clay seam along the walls. Then he lowered the fire to a careful, steady burn. The storm had not arrived yet, but the frontier had already delivered its warning. And Silas understood exactly what it meant. The storm arrived before nightfall. Wind struck the basalt cliffs with a rising roar, sweeping across the benchland until the entire valley dissolved into a whiteout. Snow no longer drifted through the air. It flew sideways in long, violent sheets, erasing the horizon and swallowing the land in every direction. Outside the cabin, the world had become chaos. Snow piled quickly against the walls, packing into the corners where wind drove it hardest. Within hours, the drifts climbed halfway up the structure, forming a dense frozen barrier that sealed the lower logs beneath a thick white armor. The wind howled above it. But inside, the shelter held. The firebox burned steadily against the basalt wall. A small iron pot of stew simmered over the flame, the slow bubbling sound filling the quiet cabin with warmth and the smell of salt and beans. Silas moved calmly through the room. The goats lay against the far wall, chewing slowly and without concern. Their ears twitched now and then, but they made no attempt to rise. The hens had tucked themselves together beneath a small wooden ledge, heads hidden beneath their wings. Animals did not pretend, they simply reacted, and they were calm. Silas stepped through the interior doorway into the cave behind the cabin. The contrast was immediate. The roar of the storm faded into a distant murmur as the basalt chamber swallowed the sound. The steady drip of water echoed softly into the basin, unchanged by the violence outside. Silas rested his hand against the rock wall. The basalt felt cool and solid beneath his palm, holding its temperature the way it had held it long before the cabin existed and long before this storm began. Stone did not argue. Stone did not panic. It simply remained. Outside, the storm battered the valley with relentless force. Inside the two-chamber shelter, the system Silas had built stood quietly beyond its reach. The frontier had delivered its verdict, and the design had passed the test. For a long time, the storm said everything. Wind roared across the cliffs. Snow scraped against the cabin walls. The world outside seemed to contain nothing but cold and movement. Then, through the noise, another sound appeared. A dull thud. Silas lifted his head. It came again. Not the scraping of branches, not the hammering of wind-driven ice. A knock, uneven, desperate. Silas stood slowly and took hold of the heavy iron poker resting beside the firebox. The door beam groaned slightly as he pulled it free and eased the door open just enough to see beyond the drift. A shape collapsed inward. For a moment, it was impossible to tell where the snow ended and the man began. Frost coated the figure from shoulders to boots, and the wind tried to drag the body back outside before the door closed again. Silas caught the man under the arms and pulled him fully into the cabin. The door slammed shut behind them. Ice cracked and slid from the stranger's coat as he struggled to breathe. His beard was stiff with frost, his face pale beneath the frozen layer of wind-blown snow. When his eyes finally opened, Silas recognized him. Cal Rourke, the freight hauler who had laughed about the cave in the mercantile. Cal's lips trembled as he forced the words out. "Road gone," he rasped. Mail wagons slid off the ridge. He coughed hard, trying to drag warmth back into his lungs. Hardwick and his wife, still out there. For a moment, the storm hammered against the cabin walls like a living thing. The man who had called the cave a tomb now lay shaking on its floor. And outside the door, 2 more lives were still trapped in the white darkness. Silas helped Cal closer to the fire and wrapped a rough blanket around his shoulders. The freight hauler's hands trembled violently as warmth began to return to his fingers. For a moment, the cabin fell quiet again. Silas turned and looked at the supplies stacked along the wall. The sack of flour, the beans, the salted meat hanging near the warmth of the firebox. Every piece of it had been measured carefully, rationed for a single person through a long frontier winter. Adding 1 man to the shelter had already changed that balance. Adding 2 more could break it entirely. Silas understood numbers. The frontier had taught him that survival was often a kind of arithmetic, but as he looked down at Cal, his face gray, his body shaking uncontrollably against the cold floor, the calculation shifted. This was no longer the cold arithmetic his father had spoken of. Silas filled a small iron pot with hot stew and wrapped it in cloth. Then he gathered a coil of rope and lifted the lantern from its hook near the door. On the frontier, a simple rule often mattered more than numbers. If a man could help, then the decision had already been made. Silas lifted the door beam aside. The storm was still waiting outside. The moment the door opened, the storm lunged inside. Wind slammed into the cabin like a living force, driving needles of snow across the floor before Silas forced the door shut behind him and stepped into the white darkness. He tied the rope around his waist and looped the other end around a thick basalt spur beside the entrance. The cliff would be his guide. The lantern in his hand cast only a weak circle of light. Beyond that glow, the storm erased everything. Snow blasted sideways so hard it stung the skin through cloth and leather. Silas leaned into the wind and began moving along the rock wall. Step. Grip the stone. Step again. The basalt cliffs were the only fixed thing left in the storm. Everything else, the ground, the sky, the horizon, had vanished into swirling white. After several long minutes, a dark shape appeared through the blowing snow. The mail wagon. It had slid from the ridge road and overturned against a low drift. One wheel jutted crookedly into the air, while the rest of the wagon lay half buried beneath hard-packed snow. Silas pushed forward. Two figures crouched against the sheltered side of the wreck, wrapped together in a frozen canvas tarp. Mr. Hardwick lifted his head first, eyes wide with disbelief as the lantern light reached him. For a moment the merchant could not speak. Beside him, Lena Hardwick barely moved at all. Silas pulled the tarp aside and forced them both to their feet. He wrapped a wool scarf across Lena's face and pressed the warm pot of stew into Hardwick's hands. "Drink," he said simply. The merchant obeyed without argument. There was no time for explanations. Silas tied the rope around the wagon frame, then led the line back toward the cliff, pulling the couple behind him step by step through the blinding storm. The wind howled. Snow hammered against their coats. But the basalt wall remained beside them, steady and unmovable, guiding them through the white void like the spine of the earth itself. Silas kept moving. Each step carried the three of them a little farther away from the freezing chaos behind them and closer to the quiet shelter waiting in the rock. Silas forced the cabin door shut behind them and dropped the heavy beam back into place. The storm seemed to disappear beyond the door, not completely, but enough that the sound changed from violent chaos to a distant roar outside the walls. Warm air wrapped around the three soaked figures almost immediately. Hardwick staggered a step forward, staring at the firebox where steady flames licked along the basalt stones. Lena sank slowly onto a bench beside the wall, her gloved hands trembling as feeling returned to her fingers. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. They had expected cold. Instead, they had stepped into warmth. Silas took the lantern and motioned quietly toward the opening behind the cabin. "Come," he said. They followed him through the inner doorway and into the cave chamber. The change stunned them even more. The basalt room stretched quietly beyond the cabin wall. Goats rested along one side, chewing slowly on dry grass bedding. The hens stirred in their corner, blinking sleepily at the lantern light. Near the cave entrance, pale green leaves rose from shallow soil beds. Kale, turnip greens, small, stubborn life, growing where no one in Juniper Crossing believed anything could survive. Hardwick's gaze moved slowly across the chamber, the stacked firewood along the wall, the coils of rope, the sacks of salt and grain stored safely above the ground. Then he heard it, the soft, steady rhythm echoing through the stone. Drip, drip. Water from the seep line slid down a carved channel and fell neatly into the basin Silas had shaped from rock. Hardwick's shoulders sagged as the truth finally settled in. "We were wrong," he said quietly. Behind him, Cal Rourke stood completely still, staring at the system in silent disbelief. Silas said nothing. He simply stepped back toward the fire, filled 3 bowls with hot stew, and handed one to each of them. "Eat," he said. The basin continued to fill slowly in the background, one drop at a time, and for the first time, since the storm had begun, no one in the room had anything left to argue about. The storm did not pass quickly. For 2 full days the wind circled the basalt cliffs, burying the benchland beneath deeper and deeper snow. The cabin stood sealed behind its white walls, while the world outside disappeared into drifting silence. Inside the shelter, the system continued its quiet rhythm. Hardwick and Cal watched. Silas rose before the fire faded each morning and fed it with measured pieces of pine. Not too many, not too few. The warmth spread slowly through the cabin while the goats stirred and the hens clucked softly from their corner. Water gathered steadily in the basin. Food appeared in careful portions. eggs from the straw bedding, strips of dried meat cut thin, bowls of stew stretched across several meals. Nothing was wasted. Between tasks, Silas checked the clay seams along the walls, pressing a hand against them whenever the wind shifted outside. If even a thread of cold air slipped through, he sealed it again, without hesitation. Hardwick began to understand something that had escaped him in town. This was not luck, not stubbornness, it was design. And design, once proven by winter itself, did not need defending. It simply worked. When the storm finally loosened its grip, the valley returned slowly. The wind weakened first. Then the sky cleared. Sunlight spread across the benchland, revealing a landscape buried under deep, white drifts. On the third morning, Hardwick and Cal prepared to leave. The merchant stood near the door for a moment, turning a small coin between his fingers. Then he placed it carefully on the wooden table beside the fire. A gold piece. Silas looked at it but said nothing. Hardwick met his eyes. "Payment," he said quietly, "not charity." Outside, the snow still rose nearly to the lower window, but the road back to Juniper Crossing could be found again now that the storm had passed. The men stepped into the cold sunlight and began the long walk back across the benchland. In the days that followed, the story moved through town. At first, quietly, then with a different tone. No one spoke about the boy in the useless cave anymore. Instead, they spoke about the young man who had turned black basalt and empty wind into something that could outlast winter. People did not come to praise him. They came with sacks of grain, coils of rope, tools to trade, and the small shelter at Ravenmouth Draw slowly became a place where work, not words, decided a man's worth. Spring arrived quietly. The snow withdrew from the benchland in slow patches, exposing dark soil and the familiar scatter of black basalt beneath the sun. Meltwater slipped through the coulees, and the hard silence of winter softened into the small sounds of returning life. Inside the shelter at Ravenmouth Draw, the system continued to grow. One morning, the goats produced 2 small kids, their thin legs trembling as they stood for the first time on the packed earth floor. The hens laid regularly now, eggs appearing in the straw almost every day. Silas expanded the work without ceremony. He carved a narrow, cold-smoking alcove into a crack in the basalt wall, where cool air drifted steadily upward. A deeper root cellar followed, dug carefully into the shaded ground beside the cabin. On the southern side, he fitted a small, wind-protected frame of salvaged wood and glass, capturing more sunlight for the greens growing near the cave entrance. None of it felt like an ending. Silas rested his hand against the basalt wall and looked across the quiet valley. The stone was not a finished answer. It was simply the beginning of the next design. And on the frontier, real peace was rarely found in rest. It was found in work that never truly ended. If you had been 17, handed a deed to a useless cave, and sent into the frontier, would you have walked away or tried to build something from it?